Hello, Anna.
Hello, how are you?
I'm very good. Thank you for joining us. I want to introduce you a little bit to our audience who's watching as we speak. Anna Puigjaner is an architect. She is a co-principal of the Barcelona-based architecture studio MAIO. She's at the same time a researcher. She has become known to me for her fabulous research work on the kitchenless city, introducing an interesting typology in the early to mid 20th century. And she's extensively writing, researching, teaching in various places, last in Colombia. So Anna, I was wondering, how did you experience the pandemic? Because you told me that part of it you experienced in New York, and the second half of it you experienced in Barcelona. How was it different?
Well, I think that here in Barcelona, we never expected to hit so hard. So meanwhile, in New York, we were really scared already at the time. I guess, I'm not sure why, but so when everything hit in Spain, I was living in New York and seeing how fast it evolved. And drastically how the U.S. closed borders with the EU to protect the U.S. And nowadays we know that closing borders, it's not the right decision at all.
Yeah. So, but how would you describe the differences in discussing this situation in the U.S. and in Europe?
Well, I think that we have something in common. There's the concept of freedom. It's really rooted in the U.S. culture, but also here, maybe the sense is different, but we do value a lot our democratic processes, but also our freedom. So all the civil control that the pandemic push, that it was already there. So we were having these discussions before, but the pandemic pushed to the limit that now we are faced to decide if we want to have an app on our phone in order to protect ourselves and our loved ones and our community or not. So I think that, for instance, those discussions are exactly the same, and obviously also welfare systems. The pandemic turned visible how our governments do deal with their own welfare, and the differences are really high. So obviously the US system is way different from Spanish, but also from other European systems. And that's why now we have so many social movements, protests and strikes that are asking for better social rights. So probably we start talking about health, and now we're talking about social rights.
Okay. There's this idea that basically all Corona did was not to create any kind of new issues or challenges, but basically to amplify existing ones. Would you agree?
Totally, yes. Yeah, all the racial inequalities that nowadays are crowding the streets, but not only in the US, but also in Europe and UK especially, were already there. It's just that pandemic has turned visible all those realities, and also probably has pushed us to be much more sensible to them. Mm-hmm. And somehow maybe also we are in a moment that we have passed through many crises already. So everything is starting to collapse and overlap. Mm-hmm. So as we were talking the other day briefly, I think that there's a direct link between the pandemic and all the social movements. And somehow a pandemic have been the click in order to push them to happen. And I'm obviously, as everyone, I'm thrilled, excited, and at the same time scared. So it's really a difficult feeling to express. But definitely, for instance, in New York, that we're talking a lot about race inequality that was visible through pandemic, but obviously due to police excess of violence, we were definitely pushed and moved to strike. But during the pandemic, the neighborhoods that were neglected in New York were hit the most. Pandemic divided the society between those that could stay at home and those that couldn't stay at home, and that was brutal.
Is there anything? Yeah, is there anything that you think, as an architect, our discipline could actually help to alleviate problems like these in the future, or is it a purely social problem that has to be addressed politically, on the level of healthcare and so on, or is there anything that design can actually affect?
Our cities have been proved to be resilient. So during pandemic, buildings, hotels had to be turned into hospitals, and many other ice skating into funeral homes and morgues, and like radical change in use in our buildings. So our cities have proved to be able to be resilient and to change really fast to adapt to the new needs. But I guess that probably we were not that aware, or at least this resilience, it was not on the table before. And nowadays, probably we will think about our cities and our architectures from that perspective. How our cities are able to answer to crisis, to climate crisis, to healthcare crisis, and obviously resiliency is probably the easiest or the first thing to consider, because resiliency means to be able to answer to anything. Obviously, anything is a super large, wide word that lacks of any meaning, some sort, in a way. But it's a first step.
But can you give examples of what could this urban resilience be? How can cities react to challenges that are not predictable, but that may arise at any moment? Do you mean something like turning car lanes into bike lanes spontaneously from day one to day another?
Yeah, this has happened in Barcelona during these last months that we were totally locked down. We had a couple of hours in the evening to get out, and we still have a couple of hours in the evening to get out, and a couple of hours in the morning to get out and have a walk. Mm-hmm. And obviously, as you can imagine, our city is really dense. So during those 2 hours, the streets are crowded by people. And so, in order not to turn the situation dangerous, the city council decided to turn the car lanes into pedestrian lanes. Mm-hmm. So nowadays we have way much more pedestrian areas than car areas, and it seems that this change is gonna stay. Somehow we're learning the values, and what I'm saying it's an obvious thing. We are all aware of this. We're learning the values of decreasing the traffic, of slowing down, of not taking too many flights, etc. So there are things that are positive, and there are things. So not everything is negative, and we have to be aware of those positive things and try to keep them or empower them in the next years.
And you're confident this will be done like this, that it's not just kind of considered as a momentary crisis management, then we can go back to the old normal? Or do you think really that there will be an understanding that we have to permanently change a couple of parameters in the ways in which we live our cities?
It's always difficult. I mean, I think it's at this moment, it's when you live in the now, it's always difficult to talk about the now, and even more difficult to talk about the future. I always consider that when we talk about the future, at the end, we're talking about the now, really, because the future, we cannot see it. So Lewis Mumford, he has a wonderful book published already almost 100 years ago, I think, about utopias. And he describes utopia like that. Utopia is a type of literature that uses the future to criticize the now. So through utopia, we're able to understand which are our weak points, which are our strength points. And so probably my opinions, even when I think about the future, I'm just being more aware about the now. Mm-hmm. And I think that there are things that will stay and obviously will change the way we live. Or in other words, they have already changed. We are more used now to talk online. We're more used now to help our community. So community help has increased a lot. And I don't think that that's going to go that easy, because we're really thankful for the support of our neighbors, as well as we have been the support for them in certain moments during these last months. So I think those bonds are really going to be difficult to break.
Yeah. I've known your work basically through this study that you did, Kitchener City, and in this study, I really found impressive how you described this quite important phenomenon of a typology that now we don't know any longer, which is basically a kind of boarding home type of accommodation where people live but don't have an individual kitchen, because the entire cooking and eating aspect is being done in central facilities. And you show also that this typology completely broke down with the New Deal and the suburban movement. Do you predict, or could you imagine that similar developments would happen now, typologically speaking, that we have entirely new typologies or the breakdown of existing ones?
Do you think that, so the question is if they would, if the cities will be empty in the future?
No, not this. No, but would maybe office buildings or housing buildings change typologically substantially after that?
Yeah, I think that working from home is going to be more accepted. It's been already accepted, and it has the values that it allows us to deal with family life in an easier manner. But at the same time, it has its problematics. So it's difficult to have a proper space to work, to have a good connection to, there are many things that at home are a bit complicated. So to have, to imagine that our homes might change a little bit to host domestic workspaces, that would be a possibility. But also how those offices would then for decrease and probably be substituted by more housing, that would also be a possibility. But again, I think we're speculating here, right? And so take it as a speculation. But I would say yes. I would say that probably homes will get much more professional, and they're much more productive, and production spaces as well, much more domestic. And it's something that it's related with the time that we're living, this eternal end of capitalism that we have been struggling since the 70s, since the oil crisis in 73. We are like in this moment of late capitalism, where capitalism has become extremely aggressive, but at the same time, we are all feeling that we're shifting towards something else, and we don't know what. But one of the essence of our capitalist system is actually that from the origin, it divided spaces from production from domestic spaces. So before the first industrial revolution, the home used to host production activities. So there was not such a distinguish as domestic labor and productive labor. It was due to the first industrial revolution and the evolution of capitalism that the home got detached from production spaces. So this dichotomy has been since the beginning extremely problematic. among other reasons, because suddenly that work that happens within the domestic sphere is considered secondary work, badly paid, or illegally done. So it's really gender, also with a lot of gender biases and race biases. Meanwhile, all the work that happens outside home, it's being considered productive, in pro of evolution, and positive.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that we are shaking a little bit this dichotomy and somehow bringing back productive space of productive work into home, and linking it into with other types of domestic work, it might be super interesting to see how this evolves, and therefore which kind of new social rights, economical realities will emerge thanks to this.
Okay. You know, one question I always had during this pandemic was looking at Spain. Why has it been hit so hard, Spain? We were looking in kind of horror to it. First Italy, then Spain. The numbers were going up high. The culture of public space is good in Spain. I think the healthcare system as well. Is there any kind of condition that plays a role in this that has to do with maybe the culture of dwelling in Spain?
Yes, unfortunately, we realize that our cities are one of the densest cities in Europe. So we realize that our density is extremely high compared to other cities. And that means that per apartment, we have a ratio of much more inhabitants. And also the ratio of a space per inhabitant is lower. So that influenced a lot during the evolution of the pandemic. And on the other hand, we realize that that's why we have such a good urban space, because we live mostly outdoors also due to that indoor condition. So our public spaces are wonderful and they work really well, but when we cannot use them and we just rely on the indoor spaces, then all these conditions, but also social inequalities emerge. We had neighborhoods that were extremely hit because of the high density per apartment, especially in the city center, and that was dramatic. And obviously, due to this situation, one of the arguments and discussions that is on the table nowadays is precisely the size of each apartment and their quality. So suddenly, with around the disciplinary discussion here in Barcelona is turning back to look to the idea of home and how our houses are defined. It's a conversation that has not been that much on the table for a long time. So it's really positive that from even the city, the municipality, that discussion is coming up and gaining a lot of attention.
I think Barcelona now has a higher population density than Paris, which used to be the most dense city in Europe. Is there any kind of political shift towards reducing density recognizable due to this kind of discussion? I mean, due to this kind of experience of this high density and the difficulty of lockdown conditions?
Politically shift? Well, I'm not sure if I'm following, but
I mean, do politicians say maybe the density is the problem?
It has been said, but I cannot recall a specific article, but yes, it has been said. We are lucky that we have Ada Colau as a mayor, and it's not new that she has interest on housing. So she comes from, she was an activist on housing previous to being a politician. So that's also, I think that's also is one of the reasons why during pandemic, not only because it was evident that the housing stock was not well arranged or well distributed, but also that she has an interest towards housing. It's so important how our politicians react to the pandemic. And And probably it's one of the things that if we think about 20 years ago or 25 or 30 years ago, we're way much more politics, all of us. We're talking about politicians, we listen to politicians, we do value when a politician speaks properly and not. And I think that's one of the consequences of our time.
I mean, let's be specific architecturally here to get to the bottom of this. By the way, there's a little slight echo of my voice in the speaker system. Could you potentially also use earphones? Would you have them available? Because then we might not have this kind of reverberation.
I need to change the device.
If it's too complicated, forget it. We'll deal with some echo. My team just informed me. Good. So the question is, for instance, if you take that seriously, let's say your mayor says we need to increase the dwelling size per capita in existing apartments throughout Barcelona by 20%. You know, something that, for instance, La Coton Vassal does with their kind of refurbishments of modernist housing in a systemic way. And they use this specific device of the winter garden that is attached to the building on the outside. And indeed, they reach these numbers. And it has a critical mass effect on the way that you can live in an apartment like that. You have outdoor space and so on. How would you imagine this in a city of Barcelona with the Eixample, with that particular type of building? Would this be systematically possible to basically say, yeah, let's do that so that people can both live and work to some degrees in their apartment, and that they have just more space that they can decently live in? How would you architecturally approach such a typological modification in the existing body of the city? Is it possible at all?
It's totally possible. Actually, before years ago, one of the conversations that I know that the city council had was about building more social housing on existing avenues and principal roads of the city, principal streets. So they were trying to basically cover some of the car traffic with housing, or just substitute the car traffic with housing. It's one of the probably it's really smart because we don't have that much space, but we do have a lot of space for car. So if you consider that as areas for housing, it's a lot of surface. Another study that they started was to raise the number of housing by using the air rights. There are a lot of air rights in Barcelona that have not been used. Probably now on the table, we would have to add the idea of density. So how that extra volume or extra surface could decrease density in the city. Is it the sound better?
It's when you talk, it's okay. It's, I think when I speak, my voice through your loudspeaker is fed into the system again. But
what about if I pull down the voice?
Yes, probably that would work. Yeah, already.
Okay.
It's not dramatic. It's fine. Okay, but yeah, but on the level of the individual apartment, imagine you have like a building with 10 parties in this building. Would you imagine that then you combine 2 apartments into one and make it a larger apartment? Something like this.
Well, in the building that we built, the 110 rooms in Eixample, that was a private promotion, and that building is composed by rooms that can be arranged and rearranged to define different apartment size. So it's already built to allow that change to happen, to be able to increase or decrease the size of each apartment. If our architectures do think from the beginning about that, it's really easy to do in the future. So it's really simple. It's about arranging a proper structure and making sure that all the supplies are properly arranged. That those changes can happen easily. But now we're working for the municipality building social housing that it's arranged in the same manner. So it's already, they are already promoting a typology that can allow decrease and decrease through time. And that assures, for instance, that when the elderly cannot or don't want to live within those large apartments, they can easily decrease their apartment, therefore consequently their end of the month cost, without the need of moving out of the building and therefore out of the community that they have been attached for a long time. So socially speaking, is of interest from the city council because of that facility to be resilient as a housing type. But this type, we actually is a reenactment of the Champla type. So it was a housing typology that emerged in the 19th century here in Barcelona, and through the decades, through the 20th century, it stopped to be replicated and used. But it was already there in the 19th century, and it has been proved extremely successful. And most of the buildings that were built based on that original typology are still up.
Okay. So should we just continue in the Champla way?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I like that. But if you did that, if you basically increase the number, let's say the square footage per person, obviously the density, the population density of the city would decrease.
Mm-hmm.
So we would reduce density in order to make the city more resilient to kind of negotiate conditions like these, right?
I wouldn't say the city at large. I would say just certain areas of the city.
Okay.
So I live in a neighborhood that our density is quite okay. Mm-hmm. But there are other areas in the city that are not. So I wouldn't, it's difficult, it's really complicated to just come up with a solution that can affect to a whole city. Mm-hmm. But case by case, yes.
Okay. Would you said that basically Spanish cities have a good functioning culture of public space. You have a lot of parks and so on. Do you think we need more of them? Because one of the observations during this crisis was that on a general level, we have not enough non-commercial green space or public space that people can flock to when in such a situation. So when all cafes and all kind of commercial public environments are closed during a lockdown, and then you really realize how much actual public space does exist in the city. Where is a square with a tree giving shadow and a bench, or some steps that you can actually sit outside and spend some time? Do you think that needs improvement or not in terms of the infrastructure?
In terms of public space, we do have a lot. What we don't have is that much green space, and that has been an old conversation. But nowadays, it has been new due to climate change. So nowadays, the claim for green spaces in the city is not that much addressed towards, the idea of green spaces for leisure, but rather the idea of green spaces that turn the city much more sustainable, because they capture the rainwater. They are able to keep a certain fauna within the city that it's good for the environmental nature cycle. So actually most of the buildings that we're building now in the city, they are being built in the city nowadays, they do consider not only capturing the rainwater but filtrating to the ground. So both buildings and streets need to be able to capture the humidity and rainwater in order to turn our underground healthier. And this is one of the conversations. So for me, it's interesting how the greenery now, it's not that much considered for leisure, but rather for health, for climate change, etc.
For the metabolism of the city, basically.
Yes.
Right. So the city can breathe and humidify it and so on. Yeah. All right. And do you think this kind of transformation of the city is increased or rather burdened by this kind of emergency condition? I mean, the attempts to kind of create these kind of more intense green spaces in the city. Do you expect this to happen more now, or will it be harder? Because the general argument here being that because we have such a economical crisis and a breakdown of the economy so much, and Spain in particular after the 2008 real estate economy, it's like a second hit that is just cruel, in particular in Spain. Some people say that now it will be more difficult to actually push for the kind of ecological transformation of our society, because the side of the discussion saying, you know, we could have done this without Corona. We had the money then, but now we have to save our economy so much we can't afford anymore to rebuild our society to a green one. And that there's a lot of fear that basically we turn into a kind of fossil style economic regime now that is just targeted towards making money, reshuffling the economy again, and then maybe in 10 or 20 years we can worry about again about the environment, when of course it will be too late.
The pandemic cannot be detached from the ecological crisis and the climate change at all. We are in a moment that we are rethinking about systems of governance. The climate emergency pushed all countries to the limit. We are in need of institutions that are able to put all these power forces around a table. And so there are a lot of conversations around that, how to achieve, as the OMS did, how to achieve a same level of strength in relation with climate change. I don't think it's to try to detach all crises and solve each crisis in separate. I think it's a huge mistake.
Mm-hmm. Of course.
It's just how we operate globally speaking, that we need to rethink our systems of governance, our ways of consume, and it's just solving one will just make the rest worse, and we're gonna be in another bad cycle. So
yeah, I mean, we can make the connection to the social situation and social security. I think in Spain has now passed a kind of basic social minimum fee for the people because of this crisis, because people can't make money. That has been in discussion before the crisis as well, whether we need to implement a basic income, because it will be increasingly difficult to earn your living through labor. And we see this in many countries, in Switzerland as well. There has been basically a big public discussion and even like a public vote about it. So this kind of idea of installing a minimum basic income is in discussion. It's largely criticized from some part of the discussion, saying that if you do this, people will no longer work, the economy cannot function this way, and so on and so on. Is it likely that this kind of income structure that has been passed in Spain, maybe you can explain a little bit how it actually works, would be there going on after this crisis, or do you also think this is just a temporary alleviation measure?
It's difficult to say. This is really difficult to say.
Because the interest of this whole thing would be, of course, if this crisis and the kind of emergency measures that are taken are actually able to show us that we can operate in a different way. For instance, that we can pay a basic income fee, or that we can reduce 30% of the street surface used hitherto for cars, shifting them over to bicycles and pedestrians, that we can work from home, that we can do all these kind of things that we just did now in order to kind of survive this crisis, realizing that they have actually some positive effects and that we could continue them afterwards, so that this crisis could actually act as an incubator of social change, and also an argument in favor of implementing them, while before this crisis, these changes were most of the time considered as unrealistic and not possible to be implemented.
One of the things that are really important is to turn visible the needs. And media plays an important role for good or bad, but just turning visible needs allow things to change. So this minimum earning a month in order to assure that certain certain people that feels themselves that ends themselves in certain circumstances can move on, it's been crucial, and I hope will stay, but it's really difficult to say. There's an anecdote about the Japanese society that I've always, now that I'm doing a lot of research on collective cooking in Japan. The research that the collective kitchens that I used to research about the 19th century. Now what I'm doing is research that it deals with and what I call neighborhood kitchens. So are kitchens that do operate not for one building or for one, close community, but rather they do operate for the neighborhood, and they are related as a network with a network system. And there are in Tokyo, there are a lot of them, and in Japan at large, there are a lot of them that emerged after 2008, precisely in 2012. And they emerge as an answer to an awareness of poverty. But nowadays, those kitchens are for everyone. And they're called Kodomo kitchens, and they do operate for the children. So at the end, also, it's not really for the children, but because adults or anyone can go and have dinner, and they're community based. They're really nice. Well, I'm talking too much about this.
No, it's interesting.
What I wanted to say is that in 2008, for the first time, the government of Japan started to publish the ratio of poverty. Imagine, they never did before. And it's not that they lack of poverty before. It's just that suddenly there was a shift in the government. So what we could compare with the U.S. Democratic Party got elected, and sadly just for a few years. But during those few years, they changed a lot of policies. And one was this: they started turning visible poverty. And that collide with 2008 crisis, that obviously, as we know, a lot of people got fired. And they found themselves in the same situation of some of those, some of those scenarios that those studies pop up. Okay. So as a consequence, a sense of community health emerged really fast in Japan. And as a consequence, not only these shared kitchens, but many other community-driven initiatives emerge. Then nowadays, they do receive help from the government, and there are a lot of them that are supported and driven by the government. So nowadays, we cannot say that it's just a bottom-up movement, but a top-down as well. What I think about this is that it's so important to turn visible. And the pandemic is helping us to turn visible a lot of inequalities and social
disparities. Yeah. Okay. Just to understand, do you eat for free in these community kitchens?
No, not.
So how are they
totally
different from commercial restaurants?
Yes. They're very, very different one from the other. So there are a lot of ways of managing, but in general, they're run by a group of people, most of them by elderly, that do collect groceries from donations, and then they cook for the community, especially for the children. With the children, most of the children also actively participate in the process of cooking, and in some cases they sell the dinner, the meal for a reduced price. But it's really reduced price; it's symbolic. But that little amount help them to buy other things. but some of them are totally for free. So they depend on. Also, if you're a kid, you pay a price, and if you're an adult, you pay another price. And if you're a person in need, you don't pay.
Okay. I'd like to remind our audience here, you can also ask questions. Just type them into the commentary field, and then I can read them. Try to make them not longer than 3 lines, and otherwise it's difficult to read them for me. If you have a question for Anna that really deals with this situation, please do so. We have still about 10 minutes that we can talk, and I'll be attentive at anything that pops up in the commentary field. Coming back to our discussion, do you think that this model of this kind of, let's say, communal public space infrastructure that is developed bottom up but then taken up top down, as you were describing in Japan, could be also applied to more than just public cooking? Or where do you see the, let's say, the general kind of value of this kind of specific observation?
Well, I'm always interested on those domesticities that break the limits between the private and the public, and are able also to reestablish and preset and redefine preset social but also economical structures. And I think in those we can find a tool to break down biases like gender biases or age biases, but also economical biases. And for me, the kitchen is just one excuse, but at the end, what I'm talking is about all that domestic work that happen indoors, that happen in the private realm. What happens when it's turned public? There's a lot of debates about if it's being paid or not, for instance, who does it. Then a lot of legal and municipal policies and government policies start to be somehow conflictive as well, because suddenly it's not clear if it's public or not, and if it's public, they need to be under the umbrella of certain regulations, but if it's a house, not really. So I think that also it pushes to the edge all policies that are preset, and they need to be rethought in relation with all the systems of caring. So I do imagine those spaces could be expanded to caring of the children, but also caring of the elderly, but a closed system of healthcare that it's more domestic, and it's not related with healthcare centers or hospitals, but it's something much more close to your daily life. Yes.
Okay, there's one reader question here that is directed to the community kitchens in Japan, and whether you believe that these will also stay after this. Will they be solid enough to be a permanent infrastructure?
They started in 2012. Well, the initiative was after 2008, but officially they were named in 2012. Okay. And nowadays there are thousands in Japan. Wow. And every year, where I'm researching with 2 of my colleagues at Columbia University about this, and we are aware that we're doing this research this year, but next year is going to be our numbers are going to be outdated already. So we have the problem of how to do a research that is going to be overdue in a few months. They're growing. They will stay. They don't depend on pandemia. Actually, pandemia have put a lot of pressure on those community kitchens. Initially, because they were obviously not secure. But also, on the other hand, they were really needed especially for the elderly. So when they closed, some of them when they closed in some, I'm researching not only Japan but other countries. So I have been looking to how the different governments react to in the pandemic moment in relation with the kitchens, and when some of them were closed. But that affects a lot to communities that depend on the kitchens. So, and obviously in a moment, especially for those that were dependent, as the elderly, that could not get out, or it was unsafe to get out, and they really depend on the community help So it has been quite an issue in the last months, and luckily some of them are open again with new rules and health security, but luckily running.
Mm-hmm. I mean, in some way, one could describe this kind of community kitchen system almost like an informal economy. Not like, because it's not entirely driven by exchange value. You pay this amount of money to get that kind of soup, but it's it's almost done under the radar of our normal concept of economy. Do you think this? I mean, this is a classic way to integrate people which are excluded by our economical system because simply they have no income, to include them again into society. Could you imagine that this logic of informal commerce could be applied through other sectors of the city if we consider it as an economy? Public transport, for instance, any kind of partaking into urban services that we normally need to pay something for.
Well, yes. Now we're entering into a field that is really dangerous because we're also entering a bit into the share economy
totally
system, and that's extremely dangerous because it's totally the opposite. I guess that you're asking this because of a question that has been thrown.
Yeah, somebody asked the question.
And,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
And there's a huge difference. I just want to state there's a huge difference between the informal commerce that we might imagine, for instance, in Mexico. In Mexico, there are collective neighborhood kitchens, and that's why I'm quoting Mexico. So it's still really different, those informal kitchens that do happen in the street, than the collective neighborhood kitchens. The main difference is that the collective neighborhood kitchens, they do have an association. And that provides to the group of people that is engaged with the kitchen a voice. So suddenly they have a political voice because they are not only under defining themselves under association, but they do try to be networked with other kitchens. And thanks to that fact, governments start to listen to them. So I think that's the huge difference. There's a will and a name to have a political voice from the beginning when you enter one of those or you participate in one of those community kitchens. You're part of a whole.
I mean, it's not only related to informal economies. It could also be part of a formal economical structure, such as to say that the public hand or the government decides basically to make the public transport system of the city for free, as it happened in Luxembourg. Or like a city like London, for instance, that makes its museums, the permanent collections, basically for free, because it understands it should be a public amenity, like water in the fountains of Basel, where you have 200 fountains and you can drink water from it and you don't have to buy it. Do you think we need more infrastructure that is actually vital for the survival of a community to be taken out of the economic loop?
Yes. I think that this comment that you're raising now is extremely important, not only to understand that what is cheap and what is expensive, it relates on policies at the end of the day.
Yeah.
But also what should be for free and not, what should be a right and not, it depends on laws and policies, and everything can change. I think that one of, just look at the US. We have the right to have the police, but we don't have the right to have a lot of essential needs covered.
Yeah.
And that's why the police system is placed under doubt, not only because of the violence, but also because it substitutes a lot of other basic needs to be covered, that should be covered also in our taxes.
I mean, we have to come to an end because you said you need to be ready before 6, right? There's just maybe one last thing that I wanted to know is, we know that the development of the city has been very marked and characterized in the past 2 or 3 decades by the neoliberal understanding that the market can solve any problem better than politics, right? So through many countries, this kind of understanding was commonplace, which is one of the reasons, of course, of the real estate crisis in 2008 and the following years. Now, during this emergency condition, governments were really under pressure to act. And we can see that in countries where they acted strongly, they could survive these conditions better than countries that believe that politicians are no good. Could this yield a situation where the understanding that maybe governments need to govern and take decisions about how to structure our lives could be actually become more popular again and more used?
Look, maybe to close the conversation, as I have to rush, but I have to say that I'm enjoying it a lot. So I'm sorry.
It's fine. It's the time we wanted to end anyway.
But one of the things that it has been, one of the best text articles that I have read during pandemia is written by Paul B. Preciado and was initially published in El País. And afterwards, it's been published in English in Art Forum. It is an article titled "Learning from the Virus," the virus.
Yeah.
And there, Preciado explains how dangerously we are passing from a system of governance based on physical limits, territorial limits. Yes. To a system of governance based on a more liquid reality. In other words, this cyber control.
Yes.
And our next systems of governance would establish the limits of rights, the limits of movement, freedom, etc., not based on and territorial control or physical control, but rather on digital control. And we have to be aware of that. The answer is yes. It's good that our governments are once again on the spot of the political agenda and not the global market. That's important, but it's not enough. So we have to keep on putting pressure on our governments, trying to understand the different systems of welfare and how they need to grow and evolve, considering this change of society from physical to liquid, from material to immaterial.
Sounds interesting. Maybe you can share the link for this text, and we could share it with our audience later on. Don't do it now. It's fine. We can do this later.
Okay.
Is it published only in Spanish?
No, in English.
In English. Okay. That's cool. But it was first in El País and then later somewhere else. Okay. Sounds good. Well, thanks a lot for this beautiful discussion. I want to let you go quickly. I want to inform our audience, tune in next week again on Thursday 18th at 5 p.m. again. And we'll talk to Theo Deutinger, who is one of the protagonists of our current show, Under the Radar. And he actually has produced new content for the show, which is interesting because the corona phenomenon just fits perfectly the thematic envelope of our exhibition. And he has worked with his students in Kassel on something that he calls the pandemic space. And he basically kind of maps and analyzes with the students how this kind of phenomenon of corona, distance regulations and so on actually informs a specific type of urban space. And it's very interesting to see these drawings, and we'll have them in the show. And then basically what I want to do with him is I want to walk through this kind of material with him and talk about it quite specifically. So it's going to be a special discussion. And the week after it, we have Jeannie Gang. The week after that, we have Eyal Weizmann, and there's more to come until the end of August, when the show Under the Radar will be terminating. So stay tuned. See you again next Thursday, and thanks a lot. Anna Puigjaner.
Thanks for inviting me. Thank you everyone for being there.
Super. Bye-bye.
Super, bye.